What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I'm going to share the 3 rules of wintertime jig fishing. Let's get into it. Rule number 1 of wintertime jig fishing is hard bottom is key. When I'm talking about hard bottom, I'm not necessarily always talking about big boulders or rocky veins or things like that. They're super obvious. A lot of times it's just a slightly harder bottom surrounded by softer bottom. Most of the time you're going to find these hard bottom areas on high spots or drop-offs. A high spot, like a hump or a top of a point, is basically created because the rest of the area around it has been eroded away by waves and wind over the years, and you are left with the top of a point or the top of a hump. You can also find hard bottom on the edge of a creek channel ledge. These hard bottom areas are going to attract bait fish, which in turn attract the bass. And even if you are fishing a brush pile or grass or standing timber or stumps, in the winter you're usually going to find the majority of your fish around those types of cover on hard bottom. And in general, when I'm graphing offshore in the winter, I'm not looking just for brush piles or just for grass or stumps or standing timber. I'm looking for those types of cover on top of hard spots. Again, the hard spots attract the heat, attract the bait, which attract the fish. So if you're fishing around in the wintertime and you don't have a hard bottom area that you're casting at, your chances of catching fish are pretty low. And when I'm fishing a jig specifically, it's a target-oriented bait. So you want that bait to get down into an area and work there very slowly and move through the strike zone to basically get those lethargic bass to come and eat it. And I don't necessarily have a preference in which types of cover I'm fishing in the wintertime. I catch fish on all different types of lakes and all different types of cover, whether that is, again, all the things I mentioned or other types of cover that I didn't mention. A lot of times too, if you are dealing with a really silty, muddy lake, you may not have like a rocky spot, but it may be a shell bed where you have mussel shells that have washed up in a certain spot. Again, usually a high spot, and that's a harder bottom area. Now I've had some really good days in the winter fishing shell beds. So really just finding that hard bottom is going to be key, but a lot of times you're not actually catching the fish off of the hard bottom spot, you're catching them out of the cover in that area. Let's say you have a brush pile on that hard bottom spot. What the bass are going to do is use that brush pile as an ambush point to ambush the shad, bluegill, crawfish, or crappie that are swimming around that area. And so they'll use the shade of a brush pile or a stump or the grass to ambush their prey. So you'll actually want to cast your jig into the brush, into the grass, into the stumps, but you're basically locating which brush piles, stumps, and grass to fish by finding the ones on hard bottom spots. So that's kind of the idea. You can also a lot of times determine which hard spots and which cover are better by graphing and seeing which spots have shad around them or bigger crappie or bigger bluegill. You can see these on your down scan, side scan, and 2D sonar views on a traditional fish finder. If you can figure out the depth that those bait fish are in, 10, 20, 30 feet of water, locate the hard spots in that same depth range and find cover around those hard spots, then pick up your jig and throw it in there. And that's rule number 1. Hard spots are key.
Really quick, guys, if you enjoy the content here on Bass Fishing Declassified, you definitely want to check out my new traditional offshore fishing playbook on fishthemoment.com. In this digital guide, I provide step-by-step instructions on how to target fish offshore without the use of live sonar. I have flowcharts on how to structure your time, as well as detailed graphics about how to react based on different weather conditions, where to fish depending on the type of lake you're on, as well as a lot of other important information that allow you to dial in your offshore fishing on lakes without the use of live sonar. This is a great resource you can print out and take on the water to take your offshore bass fishing to the next level. Definitely check it out on fishthemoment.com.
Rule number 2 of wintertime jig fishing is count the rocks. This basically means fishing your jig extremely slow in the wintertime. Again, you may not always have rocks in the area you're fishing, but the same concept applies. You basically want to feel every bump, every crack that you pull this jig over in the winter, and as soon as you come up against a limb of a tree, get stuck in a grass patch, or pull up against an actual rock, you want to leave your jig there and let it sit for 5 to 10 seconds a lot of times. Most of the areas that I fish with a jig in the winter are not going to be that big. You might have something the size of this desk here, maybe the size of your boat. So you can make very precise casts with this jig and soak that bait down there. And the longer you can leave your jig in an area and just dead stick it, the more bites you're going to get. A jig is not a bait in the winter you're going to get 30 bites a day on in most cases. There are days I've had 30 fish days in a jig, but most of the time you're dealing with 5 to 10 bites a day if you fish for 8 hours with a jig. But the 5 to 8 to 10 bites you get are going to be very big. And the slower you can move this jig, the better off you're going to be. Just try not to move that bait too much. And I think the main thing is it's not necessarily the speed that you move the bait from one spot to the other. It's more about how long you let that bait dead stick or just sit there on the bottom. The longer you can just, force yourself to let that bait sit there, the better chance you have of catching fish on a jig. And for that reason, a lot of times, if we go back to rule number 1, I'm looking for hard spots in covered areas that aren't that big. I don't want to find a spot that is 30 yards long or like the size of a swimming pool or something like that. Because if you have an area that's that big, it's going to be impossible almost to cover that area efficiently and keep your bait where you need to keep it without wasting 2 hours fishing one spot, and that's just not very efficient. So if you can find spots that are, again, the size of your boat, the size of the front deck of your boat, size of this table here, that's going to allow you to make maybe 5 casts on a spot, but each cast might take you 2 minutes. So you spend 10 minutes per spot, get that jig down there, let it just soak in whatever cover you're fishing, and you're going to be able to get a lot more quality bites and maybe take your bite percentage, if you fish the jig kind of faster, from 2 bites a day up to, again, 8 to 10 bites a day. One thing it does help with that, just to make sure your jig is down in the cover where you need it and you're dead sticking it and you can kind of feel it better, is throwing a heavier jig. I like throwing a 3/4 ounce jig. This is just a locally made 3/4 ounce football jig. Color doesn't really matter that much, but my trailer does matter quite a bit. When I'm fishing in deeper water, I like to throw a trailer that allows that bait to fall a little bit faster. So if I'm fishing, let's say 25 feet of water or more, I'm gonna go with a Strike King Menace Grub trailer. If I'm fishing in 15 to 25 feet of water, I'll go with this Big Bite Baits College Craw. This bait has a little bit more water resistance and a little bit more action than the Menace Grub, but similar profile to it, and it'll fall just a little bit slower, but I'll still be able to get it down to that 15 to 25 foot zone pretty effectively. And then when I fish less than 15 feet, instead of going to a lighter jig, let's say a lot of guys might go to a 1/2 ounce or a 3/8 ounce jig, I just change my trailer to make that jig fall slower. There's 2 reasons for that. One, a 3/4 ounce jig is a lot easier to feel. So when you pull it up against a rock or a piece of cover, you'll be able to know where that cover is and what you're feeling on the bottom. Second, you have a lot better chance of keeping that bait on the bottom when you can feel it well, which is where you want that bait, and you're not gonna be swimming it through the middle of the water column. And then third, I find that that 3/4 ounce jig, when you do hop it, has a quick fall to it, and I think it just triggers bites, or triggers those fish to at least get interested in that bait as it kind of gets into that area. But you don't want too fast of a fall. You don't want it to fall like a rock, especially in really dirty water. You want something that has more of a presence and that has a little bit more of a natural slow fall. So again, instead of going to a lighter jig, I'll stick with my 3/4 ounce jig, but go to a trailer that has a lot more water resistance and drag. And that is a Yamamoto Flapping Hog. There's 2 sizes. There's the Flapping Hog and the Flapping Hog Junior. I like the Junior size, and I just use the entire thing, rig it up on that jig, and it has about the same size in terms of length of that College Craw and the Menace Grub, about 4.5 inches, but it's wider and it has more appendages, and that will cause the jig to fall a lot slower, basically cutting the fall rate to about maybe 60 to 70% of what it is with this College Craw. If you are fishing really shallow water with a jig, let's say less than 8 feet of water, I might even go to the full-size Yamamoto Flapping Hog. It's a little bit bigger than that, and that's a really big trailer, but it'll slow that jig fall down quite a bit. If I am going to that really shallow water too, I might drop down like a 1/2 ounce jig versus a 3/4, but usually a 3/4 ounce jig is just what I have tied on. I basically just have this exact jig tied on all winter. I don't change the color. This is just like a watermelon candy type color, and I put green pumpkin trailers on the back, and I find that works in any real water clarity I find myself in, clear to more dirty. I'm not fishing in super dirty water, like less than 1.5 foot visibility. Usually in the wintertime with a jig, I'll throw spinner baits and crankbaits in those situations, but just 3/4 ounce football jig, pairing that on the Denali Lithium Pro 7'4", heavy power, fast action bait casting rod, my favorite go-to jig rod. Great sensitivity, great feel, and has a great backbone to set the hook on those fish and get them out of brush. And then I'll pair that with most of the time 17-pound, but sometimes 20-pound fluorocarbon, just kind of depending on how I'm feeling. I kind of go back and forth on it, but I would say 17 is my go-to on fluorocarbon day in, day out. So I'm not super picky. And then this is just a Abu Garcia. I think it's like a Max Pro, but just a relatively cheap reel I picked up at Walmart. So that's kind of the reel I go with. And that's the rule number 2, guys. You want to count rocks when you're fishing a jig in the wintertime. Rule number 3 of wintertime jig fishing is clouds are your friend. This might seem counterintuitive because you always think about bluebird sky, sunny days as perfect jig weather. The bass are going to get around the shade of cover like brush piles, grass, stumps, things like that. You want to throw a jig in those shade pockets. But in the winter, what I find is that a lot of times on those brighter, sunnier days, the bait fish will actually start rising up towards the surface where the water is warmer, and the bass will suspend a little bit more, even if it is around brush or around any type of cover. So if you work that jig down on the bottom, a lot of times you're not in the strike zone for those fish, and as well, the jig will fall pretty fast past those fish and they won't really follow it to the bottom and then go to eat it. So you really want to target fish with a jig when they are on the bottom. A bait I've been throwing a lot recently that I've been using on forward-facing sonar and without it to a lot of success is actually a wacky rig. This is the Core Tackle weedless wacky shot we just came out with, and there was a trip the other day where I was actually throwing a jig in a brush pile on a bright sunny bluebird sky day, no wind, and I would throw the jig and actually watch these fish on forward-facing sonar, and it would fall past the fish's face, it would hit the bottom, and I would leave it there, and none of the fish would be interested in it. It was really weird. They would just kind of leave it alone. But then I dropped this wacky rig down there, it would fall to those fish, and they would all come out of that brush pile to look at it, and then it would fall all the way to the bottom, and I would use the same retrieve, that count rocks retrieve. Dead stick it for 3, 5, 10 seconds, move it a little bit, let it sit for 5 to 10 seconds, and then they pick it up. And with this weedless wacky shot, it comes through brush piles extremely well. That's why we designed it the way we did. It literally, you can fish it through the heart of a brush pile in a grass bed. So it's sweet. And so when it's bright and sunny, I've been throwing this weedless wacky shot instead of a jig. But when the fish are on the bottom, you can probably fish a little more efficiently with a jig just because you can get it down the strike zone faster. You don't have to worry about kind of teasing those suspended fish. So if I feel like the fish are on the bottom, I'm just going to go to the jig because it's a more efficient tool for me. And usually those fish are actually going to set up on the bottom better on cloudy days. This is kind of strange, but for whatever reason I've found over the years, after years and years of fishing, that on cloudy days in the winter, those bass will sit really tight to the bottom, basically just with their bellies on the bottom. And those are my best jig days by far. I catch the majority of my big bags in the winter on jigs on cloudy days. And on sunny days, I'll catch more fish on jerk baits and crankbaits and things like that. So if you are fishing in the wintertime and you have cloudy conditions and you can't get bit on your traditional reaction baits, which you would think would work best on cloudy days, pick up a jig instead. Fish it around the same areas you might think to throw those reaction baits, or in all the hard spots and areas I talked about earlier in this video, and you're going to have a lot more success with your jig. Again, it's kind of this counterintuitive thing. I think it's mainly just a wintertime thing because the top of that water column will warm up from the sun, and again, the bait fish will rise up and those bass will rise up because the bait fish are higher. So it's, again, counterintuitive, but I've seen enough over the last 20 years fishing a jig in the winter that it is definitely the way to go. I throw a ton of jigs on cloudy days and other baits on sunny days, so definitely try that out when you head to the lake. And those are the 3 rules of wintertime jig fishing. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you leave a comment down below letting me know what your favorite tip was, and also subscribe to the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel for more content like this. Thanks for checking out this video. We'll see you on the next one.